The killing of the political activist Charlie Kirk this month spoke to two truths about modern America. First, that political violence has become an inescapable reality of the country today. Whether it's the assassination of Kirk at a rally, or the attempt on the life of Donald Trump last year, or the killing of the Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman along with her husband, more and more people are choosing to end political debates that they feel have become unwinnable with violence. And Kirk's killing also revealed just how terribly divided the country is. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's not a political divide that currently exists in America, but something that is becoming a political chasm. And the implications are huge. Just in the past few weeks, people are questioning whether the project of American democracy, in which diverse groups come together behind a single flag, has a future. And part of this story is one of political communication. It's about what story the opposition, the political left, tells about the country and how to fix it. And my guest this week has been very forceful on this topic. He's attacked Democrats for, as he puts it, appealing only to the head, and says that he believes they have conceded the terrain of emotion. That guest is Anand Giridharadas, a journalist and political pundit who has spent much of his career writing about the art of building bridges and forging common ground in politics. He's the author of Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world, and most recently, The Persuaders, winning hearts and minds in a divided age. After Kirk's assassination, Anand wrote on his platform The Ink, "You don't have to know a thing about who did this one, or that one, or the other one, to know that no one is safe until we address the chronic illness in our body politic itself." One point that stuck with me from my conversation with Anand was his belief that there's only really one thread left that unites people from left and right, and that is a sense of being, as he put it, cosmically uncared for by political elites. It's an issue that has come up again and again on this podcast in various forms, and it's one I'm very interested in because I think when we consider political violence, we often think of it as being siloed off. But as you'll hear in my conversation with Anand, political violence is really a story about the society itself, and it's an issue that cuts across politics, society, economics, and even culture. How we go about addressing that, Anand thinks, is key to solving the issue of political violence in America today. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. Anand, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We had planned this conversation a few weeks ago, but then in the interim, there's been the major event, the killing of the political activist Charlie Kirk, and it encapsulates so many of the issues that you discuss in your writing. So it feels all the more important that we have this conversation now. So I thought we'd start there before we get into your last two books. You wrote on your platform, The Ink, that this assassination was far from an outlier in terms of political violence anywhere on the political spectrum. And you wrote, if they symbolize, in your words, the magmic core of an entire culture losing its faith in the democratic method of changing things. What is it that you think about the killing of Charlie Kirk in particular that seems to have resonated so profoundly with people?
Well, this country that I live in and love is a tinderbox right now. And it is explosive in many, many different ways and places. Public opinion is explosive. Institutional decay is kind of one brush from like some calamity. The propensity for political violence, which is already rising, like feels like it can just kind of go to a different level at any moment. There have been actual killings, actual assassination attempts, and a just more generalized, but in some ways for a democracy, no less fatal loss of faith in the system itself is everywhere. So when this happened, it pushed a lot of those things over the edge. And part of why is Charlie Kirk was obviously a movement leader. He's not just a politician, although that, we've had some very significant killings and attacks on politicians, but he was a real movement leader with an actual following.
Right.
He was particularly popular with young people and was a big part of the story of why young people have moved to the right in some significant numbers, significant enough, I think, to make a difference in recent elections.
We should come back to that. But you think that he was part of
absolutely
that wider shift?
And I think he's someone who, in some ways, embodies certain contradictions of this moment, where, in many ways, what he stood for was, in my view, not consistent with the kind of democracy I want to live in. I think he's someone who spent his life arguing for a smaller we instead of a bigger we. When you think about that phrase, we the people, that this country began with, I think he's someone who had a constrained definition of who constitutes the people. I think he spent a lot of his life trying to advocate for a vision that I don't consider the best and most authentic version of what American democracy should be. However, he, as a method of approach, really believed in argument and debate and persuasion and changing minds as the way you go about the work of getting the society you want. And while that may seem like a very normal idea, unfortunately, in 2025, it is not a normal or to be taken for granted idea. And so in a certain sense, although I share virtually nothing with him in terms of the substance of the world I'd want, he was someone who loudly talked about the way of getting the world you want that I think is absolutely right.
And I think that perhaps is why it's become quite interesting to see how the left and the right in the US has responded to it. Because as you say, it's not the things that he was advocating for, and I like your phrasing of it, a smaller we, are not things that you and other progressives would advocate for. But the method of doing so was one that you perhaps share. And then obviously the method of him being silenced was one that you absolutely abhor.
Absolutely. And if you think about, and there's in my mind, there's a hierarchy, a very clear hierarchy between getting or not getting the substance of what you want out of politics, and then the way in which we try to get the world we want. And the way in which we try to get what we want is way more important in my hierarchy.
Right.
In other words, if Donald Trump wants to do a tax cut to sell this country to his 3 billionaire friends, but he's somehow able to persuade people that it's a great idea, and unfortunately, by my lights, unfortunately, lots and lots of people think, yeah, that sounds good, and he gets it passed, and Congress passes it, and he signs it. That is unfortunate from my point of view, but that is not existential for the question of whether this republic is a republic, right? That is, by the way, it may have knock-on effects that then start to implicate those kinds of things, but that's like fair ball, right? On the other hand, the January 6th insurrection, which is trying to goad a violent mob to interrupt the constitutional changing of the guard and interrupt a lawful procedure to set the next president. That is something that implicates whether or not the system kind of even exists or not.
Right.
I am willing to lose fights over substance. I'm not entitled. None of us is entitled to live in a society governed by policies that most other people don't want. If a lot of other people want things I don't want, they're gonna win those fights, and I'm gonna try to beat them next time. But I think when we get to this place of changing minds, argument, debate is not even the territory of how people think about getting the world they want, and they start to think about death and destruction and violence, that's when I get very, very worried.
We're jumping ahead a little bit, but I want to check this before we keep going, because one of the things that I liked about your book, and I like about the way you talk about politics, is that, particularly progressive politics, is that you have an understanding that it isn't enough to be right. You also have to win power. Now, I don't know if you would phrase it exactly like that, but I think you would phrase the first part of it that way. You don't just think it's okay to be right. I mean, you have this whole chapter about the way that Bernie Sanders has talked about politics, and it is a very much an eat your greens kind of politics, and that can be off-putting. So you'd accept the first part, that it's not enough to just be right.
Absolutely. And by the way, this is one of the great shortcomings of the progressive movement in America today.
We'll come to it, but I just want to get to the second bit. So the second bit then is that, but you understand that progressives also need to win power. Would you accept that premise?
Yeah.
But then, if you believe that, how come you think that it is okay for any way of winning through the democratic means? Surely you must think that the progressive must play a better ball game, let's say.
Oh, that's not what I said at all. What I said is, if Donald Trump passes an oligarch-friendly tax cut because he has most people on his side and he gets Congress to duly pass it, I may be sad, I may be upset, but I'm not worried that the republic is over and is not a functioning machinery of state anymore. I just lost the policy fight, and I'm sad that a lot of people are now going to be hurt by it. Whereas when we elect a person and that person may not be installed in office because a violent mob interrupts that procedure, I'm just suggesting that is a level of severity beyond me not getting a policy I happen to want, right? And what is dangerous in American life right now, beyond one assassination, but certainly underlying and implicated by it, is I think the number of people who feel like, on the one hand, that the old procedures, going by the book, petitioning, voting, calling your member of Congress, that the old way that the kind of gray-haired folks like me, I can't believe I'm now a gray-haired folk, but I actually have been for some time, that the gray-haired folks like me tell you to do, the level of faith in that actually making your life better is at a very dangerous low point. And people are not wrong about it.
You don't think that the Kirk killing is an anomaly. You think that it somehow reflects something wider about where the society is.
I mean, first of all, you had assassination attempts on Donald Trump. You had Minnesota, former Speaker of the House of the Minnesota legislature, murdered in her home along with her husband and dog. You've had more and more of these attacks at all levels. You obviously have January 6th. You have, and then obviously just the broader gun crisis in this country and gun deaths in general. But to me, the thing that seems reflected in the Kirk thing, whatever the person's idiosyncratic ideology may be, is that if you imagine a fork in the road where people are dissatisfied with the world they have and they're thinking about how to get the world they want, you want most people, almost everybody, ideally in that moment, to be persuaded by the fork in the road, by the road that says, try to change people's minds, try to out-organize, try to make your policies more compelling, try to, vote for someone, run for office yourself, all those things. And when societies start to be less successful is, I think, when they don't convince people of that, when they don't convince people that that road leads anywhere. And when, in fact, it's not just that people are deluded, when people are correct that that road is not necessarily much of a road. Now, I don't personally think it follows that you then resort to violence, but if you leave lots of people feeling like, come on, voting, what has that ever done for me? What has this ever done for me? What has organizing ever done for me? Right? Here are the 10 biggest problems I've had in the last 10 years. Which of those have any of these people shown any care about? Right? When a lot of people start to feel that way, you're going to start to get, let's first say, people stepping up and stepping out and trying all manner of other things. And some of that will be violence. And we can deplore the violence as we must deplore the violence while also being curious about the fact of how much alienation and pessimism we have allowed to fester in people that enables that violence.
Well, let's talk a bit about that, because I think I like that you drew a link with what is happening in the wider society. So it's not just a question about the way that politics is framed. It's also a question about what society is being built. So you wrote after Kirk's killing that when the society feels to so many like a giant conspiracy not to help them, not to see their pain and fix their problems, when that feeling festers day after day, decade after year, something curdles in the blood, a sense of being cosmically uncared for spreads, a sense that no one is coming, that you are on your own. What do you think is driving those feelings of isolation?
I think reality is driving them. Maybe the most important phrase to me in that paragraph when I was writing is that notion of being kind of cosmically uncared for. And if I think about my reporting over the last many years in this country, it's at that feeling in a very divided country in a divided time. That feeling is one of the last threads of commonality. That feeling of being cosmically uncared for, you will find among Trump voters, and you will find among Black Lives Matter activists. That feeling of being cosmically uncared for, you will find in people who were, white communities that were screwed by the housing bubble in 2008 and crash. And in, if you spend time in New Orleans, people who were stranded by the botched care after Hurricane Katrina. That is the feeling that young people have, that sense of being cosmically uncared for, the young people have because of climate change. It is the feeling that, again, you can argue about each of these expressions. It's the feeling that I think a lot of white people have about, hold on a second, when did this become majority people of color country? When did
I get it.
When was I not able to start saying keep saying these things?
Yeah, right, exactly, right.
Now you can quibble. You and I might like some of those things. You might not. You and I might, but it doesn't matter. What I'm here to tell you is a very, very large fraction of people in my society feel cosmically uncared for in a way that is going to lead to places that are not healthy, that we don't want.
How much do you think that feeling of being cosmically uncared for is a political feeling, or it is the result of economic forces?
It's all of the above. It is an all the devils are here thing. So,
wow.
First of all, if you think about, and my different books...
Very pessimistic, Anand. Very pessimistic.
Well, if you think about my different books, they've implicated different sides of it. So Winners Take All was about economic inequality and the capture of wealth and power by the billionaire class. Well, that is certainly one way in which people have been made to feel cosmically uncared for, because we have progressively moved in the United States towards an oligarchy, and first they grab all the money and power, and then first they grab all the money, I should say, and then they use the money to buy power, and now they have everything. And so obviously that makes people feel cosmically uncared for, and Bernie Sanders almost became president because of the number of people who felt that way. But I think my fellow progressives sometimes overemphasize and solely emphasize the economic story. There are other things. This has also been an age of social isolation, right? Just there's a lot of research, number of Americans who go to parties, who and COVID smashed a lot of this. Number of people go to parties, people who have people over, people who, live alone versus kind of live in community. People, how many times a year have you had someone at your dinner table? These kinds of surveys are miserable. And then you have a whole generation of guys who are basically have video games replace human contact. And again, you can judge that, not judge that. It's just a fact. You have these various technologies, including social media, which promise an illusion of connection, but also, often in reality are facilitating isolation and IRL disconnection. And layer onto that, pandemic, which I think had a bunch of consequences for mental health, and an age of political fracture that has kept families apart from each other. And then I would say above all, roiling all of this is just people find it very difficult, more difficult than I think our policymakers realize, to cope with change. And one of the probably, if I had to sum up, one of the biggest things I've learned as a reporter in 20 years of it is that we often just kind of do these spurts of progress without really thinking about what people need psychologically to make their way through. It's a lot easier to liberalize an economy like India did in 1991, 92 than to figure out how do you, if we're going to just switch to capitalism one winter,
yeah,
right. What kind of selves do people need to be? What's this going to do to their relationships? What kind of marriages, are going to fortify people for the pressures of the economy ahead? What kinds of relationships with friends.
What kind of things are you thinking of now? Are you thinking of social media? Are you thinking about artificial intelligence? Are you just thinking about a general sense of how the economy...
No,
something wider than that.
I'm talking about we make these big leaps in how our society works, but we often fail to help people cope with it, right? This is now happening with AI, but I'm talking about something more fundamental, which is if you think about the enormous strides we have made over the last 50, 60 years in empowering women to play all the roles women want to play, are capable of playing, deserve to play. We're a lot better at in some ways, like passing those laws.
Yeah, right.
Changing those numbers.
Right.
But that is a whole of society transformation deep at the level of the heart. What is a mother? What is a wife? What is a father? What is a husband? What is a child? What kind of supports do we need? How should families, take care of each other? Just the whole, that is a change that I have no doubt in my mind we should do, and we should have done, and we were right to do it. But it would sort of be like going into your house and say, look, let's just take out all the beams.
Right.
And just see what happens, because these beams are no good anymore. We have
and then you just live with it.
New ideas for beams. Let's take out all the beams, and then we'll just see, right? You need a plan. And, I would say the same thing on the extraordinary racial progress we've made. Again, these are changes that I not only support, but depend on, right? I wouldn't be here without these changes, but we are not good at helping people cope with change. We're better at just delivering the change, passing the law. And then we say okay, a very large number of white people in this country grew up, completely unaware of race, not being educated about race, not thinking of people different from them. Now suddenly foisted on them is a country that looks quite different, where they have to deal with difference in a way that their parents didn't, their grandparents didn't. Mm-hmm. I don't think it makes them evil to be completely unprepared for this.
Right.
And if those who want that kind of progressive change are not saying, here's a plan, here's art that helps you make sense of it, here's organizing that helps bring you into it, then what we are doing is we are driving people discombobulated by the future into the hands of authoritarians. And that is what has happened in country after country after country. It is hard to think about a country that has gone in that direction, where you'd say, progressive forces had a real plan for people, really organized people into the new world they want to create.
It sounds as if you accept that some of the problems that the right identify are real.
Absolutely.
So, for example, the relationship between men and women and racial relationships. But you don't agree with their analysis of what should happen.
Yes. So, for example, I had a great conversation with Senator Chris Murphy, this senator from Connecticut here, Democrat, who said, I'll give you an example that he gave me that is so smart.
Yeah,
he said,
please.
He said, you have to understand the human emotional impulse behind some of the policies the right gloms onto, because there's often wisdom in that. And then what they do is that they manipulate and weaponize and make use of it in an exploitative way. So he says, take all this stuff around banning books, banning any education about trans issues or being gay or whatever in school, getting rid of all this instruction, getting rid of teachers. Treat that as the surface of what they're doing. What is the emotion underlying that kind of political appeal? It is the emotion, the quite universal emotion of parents, heightened at times of rapid social change, of a loss of control over one's children. Right? By the way, every day I drop my kids off at school, I feel that emotion of a loss of control over children. Every time your kids come home, say a piece of slang that you don't recognize, you feel. Every time your kids, by the way, come home and have a different view of the history of your country than you right? Every time you don't know where they are late at night, you certainly might feel that sense of a loss. That's a universal experience of being a parent. In a time of rapid social change, these devices, that sense of a loss of control over one's children is widespread and is heightened. And what Senator Murphy said was, the Republicans are very good at understanding that emotion is out there. That's out there among Republicans. It's out there among Democrats. It's out there just among people. And then they step into it, and in an exploitative way, they weaponize that just generic fear of the loss of control of one's children by ginning up some fake issue, like your kid is being brainwashed to be trans at school.
Right.
Now they've
right.
lost the plot, but they've hooked into something that you are really feeling. And what he said is, we should understand that emotion and try to hook good policy into that same emotional impulse.
Yeah.
And he said, for example, in our case, that would be regulating social media use for minors. That would be an example of a good policy idea that we should do anyway, that makes use of that same underlying emotion of the fear of loss of control over one's children, instead of exploiting it to harm and divide.
I want to talk a bit about this because this was in your book, The Persuaders, and I thought this was so interesting and something that I think progressives don't talk enough about this way that you appeal to hearts and minds, and also just the way that you talk about politics to a wide group of people who most of the time are not that interested in politics. You know, they're focusing on politics for, I don't know, an hour every 6 months, something like that. They're not really paying attention every day. And you wrote,
which is like normal people.
Which is normal people, exactly right. And you said you have a big fear. The big fear I have is that we've conceded the terrain of emotion, of psychology, and of anxiety, the battlefield on which big politics is being fought right now. And you think that progressives have kind of let that go and have focused instead on what does the facts say, what does the science say, things like that.
Yeah, you know, I mean, a certain common thing has happened in many, many countries, including the UK, a lot of Europe, and certainly the United States, which is, you know, center-left parties in many places are still called labor parties, but they used to actually be labor parties. They were like an arm of the trade unions, right? They were the
organized
feeder,
labor, yeah, exactly.
right? And
yeah,
the candidates would come out of those ranks, and yeah, there'd be some other people who might vote with them, but like, that was what which, by the way, makes sense because there's like a lot of, you know, there used to be a lot of people in unions and a lot of workers. Over time, center-left parties, Thomas Piketty has written about this, got kind of divorced from labor unions. Labor unions were decimated and gutted, and center-left parties have generally become more kind of adjacent to the educated elite, city educated elites. And so that the Democratic Party today, and I would imagine you'd say the same about the Labour Party in the UK, is more of a kind of Harvard party, or you might say an Oxbridge party, than it is, you know, sleeves rolled up, you know, shop floor
100%
party.
Yeah.
So when that happens, the kinds of people and the kinds of training who then dominate that party it's lawyers, it's people who are very good at analyzing documents, it's people who are really good at making spreadsheets, it's people who are very, you know, intelligent about data and science and evidence, but it is not people who are necessarily good at telling an emotive story. It's not people who are necessarily good at connecting with people on a more guttural level. And so we have this problem of, I mean, you know, people think about the Sanders campaign as being very inspiring. That was one example. The Obama campaign, that was now, you know, 16 plus years ago. There have been very few truly galvanizing campaigns on the left in this country. And I think if I were to look to the UK or other countries in Europe or elsewhere, it's sort of the same story.
Right. Very hard. Yeah. But you've mentioned Bernie Sanders, you mentioned AOC in your book. You've just mentioned Barack Obama. You haven't mentioned Zohran Mamdani.
Well, my book came out in
no, I mean now
2022.
Course, yeah. But that would have been a real prescience if you had done that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, Zohran Mamdani is a fascinating figure, you know, Democratic candidate for mayor of New York. The election is this fall in November, and he does seem to represent something new and interesting, a kind of synthesis of some of the things that have worked for the Democratic Party in the past, but putting different strands together. You know, so after the loss to Trump in 2016, there was a progressive kind of study group that tried to figure out how can we not have this happen again. And one of the things they looked at is how do we combine what they called Bernie's them with Barack's us. And what that meant was the heart of what Bernie Sanders did successfully was name a culprit and assign a culprit to what people were feeling and experiencing. That was the novelty of what that was, right? It wasn't just generally, we need to tweak this and tweak that. It was like, you are being harmed by this class of people, and here's what we're going to do to break their power and empower you, right?
And that's a surprisingly right-wing message.
I mean, it can be, but it, has a pretty rich history on the left also. But it's something the modern Democratic Party had avoided, that kind of blaming. It was called class warfare, et cetera. Now, the most powerful thing about the Obama politics was not the them, he hates that kind of thing, but the us.
Right.
We can all come together, yeah. we, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think the analysis of this progressive study group was Barack's us. It's very powerful and moving, but it is a little anemic because it lacks this them. It lacks a clear story about who is doing what to Americans who are struggling. And that Bernie's them was very powerful and clear, but it sometimes was missing that kind of inspiring, gauzy element that also can be important. And I think what you have in Zoran is some kind of synthesis of these two things, right? Where you do have the them, we're running against oligarchs and billionaires and Donald Trump. But I think there's an element of the we can do this. There's a sunniness just to his basic temperament and affect that is different from what we've seen from some of the progressives.
I wanted to ask you actually about this idea of persuasion and about the political messaging, because how far do you think the political messaging makes a difference versus the kind of instincts of the politician? I mean, you've talked about Zoran being, very sunny, which seems real. I mean, because it's so unfiltered, it really does seem like that is his personality. He's not pretending to be that character. But even when you mentioned Barack Obama, again, the belief in something greater, the idea that America can be greater, that wasn't his messaging. He really believed it. He kind of seemed to have it in his core beliefs. So I wonder how far you think the person matters more, less, as much as the messaging.
I think the person deeply matters. If you think of those examples, a big part of Bernie Sanders' appeal was how long he'd been saying the same thing. Right. I don't think 45-year-old Bernie Sanders, if you took the same man, same views, and had just made him 45, I think it would have been a much less compelling package. Even though normally,
I think he wasn't even elected at 45. Actually,
right? The longevity of those claims, and the singular crusade, and the clear diagnosis, that was a huge part of that appeal. And if it wasn't a cantankerous, 70-something-year-old guy who didn't give a shit what other people thought of him, quite clearly. I think you'd be subtracting the whole thing, I think with Obama, same thing. You could have some random white person saying it, but the fact that it was a black person who can also speak to the white experience in this country through his mom's side, but can speak to the immigrant experience, can speak to what it means to live on different sides of this country's many divides. It was powerful when he said, only in America could my story even be possible. I mean, I think it struck deep things. And I think that's what's really, I think there's a lot of struggle about now is who do you want to tell that story against the MAGA movement in 2028? Not just someone with good ideas, but someone who has lived those ideas, someone who is a living embodiment of those ideas.
Since we've talked about 2028, let's talk about Trump, because actually we haven't mentioned his name yet, which he'll hate. When you think about the way that people want to oppose Trump, do you think that the Democratic Party has got the right idea, or do you think they are still, after so many years and years of having this guy in the political system, do you think that they still don't understand how to oppose him?
I think they still don't understand how to oppose him. And there's many, many missing elements. So one is they don't know how to fight. It is a party dominated by people who bring dandelions to a gunfight. You know, they just don't constitutionally know how to fight. They just don't. And
why do you think that is?
I think it's partly because of what I was talking about earlier, that, you know, the kind of evolution of the party to being a kind of white collar academia adjacent thing. I mean, it's like, if you basically have to get into Harvard Law School to join my club, I can't sit in my club and say, man, it's a shame that we don't have a lot of great fighters here. I'm not selecting for fighters, right?
Right.
I can assure you, if you had more trade union leaders sprinkled throughout the party establishment, you'd have a different vocabulary of conflict, right?
But don't you think it would be harder for them to talk to some parts of America?
Who?
These, let's call them political street fighters.
No, I think it would be easier for them to talk to America. What is harder is a bunch of, you know, white collar faculty club people talking to America, you know? And again, these are people I know. They're my friends. I don't mean to speak ill of people who are trying very hard, but I don't know. Like, if I just think of my friends, right? I can tell you very quickly who are the friends I have who can, like, deal when they're in a fight.
Okay.
And who are the ones who are kind of like flustered and just, you know. And unfortunately, the people in charge of the Democratic Party today are the kinds of people who are flustered. They have been selected all their life for educational achievement and for being really, you know, smart and talented and this and that. They're like a bunch of wonky goody two shoes, you know, make no mistakes, take no risks kinds of people. They're not the kind of people who, like, get into bar fights or trade union fights or whatever else. And that's fine. But I think when you're in a situation like this, it shows. And
you don't think that the other side is like that? You don't think that the conservatives are like that?
I actually think I mean, in a strange way, even though the whole project of the right in this country is so elitist in its outcomes, in a way, the movement is open to all kinds of people. I mean, it is hardly a movement of educated elites. It's a movement full of idiots. It's a movement full of, you know, whatever the opposite of educated. I mean, there's no threshold. Right.
But actually, you've used a very good phrase about this, I think, where you said that the right is very much come as you are.
Come as you are.
This kind of fun attitude. Just come in and
I'm not saying I like all these people on the right. I'm just saying at some level, if you're trying to build a political movement to represent a country, I don't know. Like, I think the Democratic Party should have some truck drivers as senators. I think it should have some public school teachers as senators. I think it should have some nurses as senators. But it just has a bunch of lawyers. It has a bunch of lawyers and, like, former wealthy businessmen.
Do you think that part of the reason why they found it so difficult to oppose Trump, and particularly now, is because of that, the lawyerism, that they're opposing him by looking at the fine print? Is this legal? Can we take this to the Supreme Court?
Have you ever, like, I'm sure you've sat in a courtroom before, right?
I have.
So, like, what is so fascinating about sitting in a courtroom, even if you, as I'm sure you have covered or, like, sat in on really serious high stakes trials, what is so funny or just interesting about those moments is outside the room, it's high stakes, right? Outside the room, it's like life and death and people are, you know, very exercised. But then if you go in the room, it is almost always the most boring thing you've ever seen.
Okay.
That's the whole point. That's what the rule of law is. You're trying to take these very high stakes things that 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, our ancestors might have just killed each other over. You put too much manure on your farm and now it's, you know, poisoning my water. Like, I'm going to kill your kids. That's what people used to do. Now what do? You hire a lawyer and it takes like 4 years and they meet like once every 6 months in this room. And you can barely even follow what it's about. And it's sort of about what motion to preclude this and, you know, a writ of this and what, right? And you can kind of make fun of it. But what it is, it's a giant system to, like, take down the temperature and turn these very difficult, fraught things into, you know, incremental matters of like paper and evidence and, and look, I think it saves like a lot of lives. However, if you think about the people who are in that system, who that is their métier, that's their profession. Those are people who are not necessarily going to be skilled at turning up the temperature because their professional competency is turning it down, is making things more boring, more procedural, more technical. They're trying to actually douse your flames as a client or someone with a sense of skin in the game, and they're trying to kind of like just calm it down, right?
And I agree with you, but I have one response which I know the audience will have picked up on. The most successful American politician this century is a law professor.
Yeah. And I absolutely, like, I am not saying that nobody can have it, right? But to be honest, he wasn't, I mean, that guy was running for president. We're talking about Barack Obama, like pretty much from the get-go. It's not like he was a law professor for 30 years, socialized by the world of law. He did everything for like a couple years and then was very quickly running for president at a young age. He wasn't, he was an ambitious person on the make who was doing a few jobs for like a couple years here, a couple years there. He wrote a book. He's a law professor. He was a state senator. He was a senator, and then he was president.
Ouch. Anand accuses Barack of being a dilettante. This is
not a dilettante. He was just like, I actually think there's no problem in someone saying, like, I think I can lead people, and like, I'm going to pursue leading them. And so I actually do not think of him as someone who is steeped in those worlds. But I will say the point stands in this way, which is he was, once he got into office and the 10,000 person rallies in Nebraska went away, he was all the time accused of being too professorial. And it was a giant political limitation for him.
Very true. And a lot of the people he surrounded himself with and who are in the Democratic Party are like that, are absolutely lawyers.
You know, so sometimes the problem with him that he had is being black. And sometimes the problem was being like too much of a pointy-headed academic who people couldn't connect with. And he definitely had both of those problems.
We are coming to the end of our time with you. But I want to make sure I ask you this, because a lot of the audience will have heard you talk about progressives, and you put yourself in the progressive camp. You consider yourself to be a progressive. Are you disappointed by the left, by your fellow travelers?
I am disappointed by the institutional leaders of that movement. I'm certainly disappointed by the Democratic Party, as I think any person with eyes is. I am disappointed by some elements of, I think, progressive movement spaces, as I wrote about in The Persuaders, that are better at keeping people out than pulling them in, that are better at gatekeeping than growing. That is something I've argued against for a long time, and I think we're seeing the unfortunate results now when the most dystopian far-right movement has this come-as-you-are vibe, and the most kind of inclusive platforms of progressive movements have a kind of gatekeeping vibe. This is the kind of world you get. Who I'm not disappointed in, who I still have very much faith in, is regular people who I continue to believe are refusing and will refuse to be ruled. I do not think Americans want a king. I think our biggest obstacle is not that some majority wants Donald Trump to be an authoritarian. I think it's the vast majority who don't even really know what's happening, who are not engaged in the process of politics. And I think it's going to be really, really, really important in the coming days, weeks, months, years, to redouble our commitment to organizing and to persuasion, to get more and more people firmly entrenched in the culture and the practice and the belief in democracy.
Anand Giridharadas, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Anand's book, The Persuaders, Winning Hearts and Minds in a Divided Age, is in all good bookstores now. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.